All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks to all of you for showing up here on the last day of classes at CBU. And I wanted to take the time to invite our guest today to speak. We're joined by Euan Healey, a graduate student, a doctoral student at the University of Glasgow, who's been spending the last few months working at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and whose research deals with the experience of the Highland Clearances, the history of the Gaels, and their connections, throughout the world. Euan has been spending the last little while traveling across Canada, speaking about his research at places like McGill. He's also spoken at St. FX, and I'm pleased to welcome him here today to the Centre for Cape Breton Studies. So join me in welcoming Euan. Please join me at the podium. Thank you.
Fishkama, how are we doing? Good afternoon. It's good to see you. My name is Euan, as Lachlan says, and I'm really happy to be here. My first time in Nova Scotia, so I'm very glad to be over here on the east coast of Canada. And I want to begin just as we start a conversation about land, to acknowledge that we are on the land of the unceded land of Indigenous people, notably here, the Mi'kmaq people, but over where I currently am working, I'm on an uninvited guest on the territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh in British Columbia. And it's a particularly important thing, I think, as a student, as someone researching Scottish history, to acknowledge the scale of which Scotland benefited and profited from stolen Indigenous territory in North America and elsewhere in the world. And my belief is that the government of my own country in Scotland and the United Kingdom should be playing a much larger role in truth and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So, to start, I'm going to briefly define the terms of what I'm going to be talking about here in the Highland Clearances back home in Scotland. So, the Highland Clearances are an umbrella term used to describe what was in reality quite a vast and diverse set of estate policies working against the inhabitants of the Gàidhealtachd, the Highlands. Use the word Gàidhealtachd, which just means the land of the Gaelic-speaking people, as many people will be familiar. The descendants of the historic Highland chiefdoms, who now find themselves looking a lot like landlords of massive estates, were possessed with the idea of improvement, the idea that the land and the people should be put to profit-making agricultural industrial use as a moral imperative. The Highlands, of course, being this area which you can actually see. I like you to use an actual visual image of Scotland there, because the Highlands, they have a visual mark, is that you can essentially see, if I can use my laser pointer on here, this should work magically, there you go. You can basically see the Highland line as it extends across northern Scotland. And this area basically was the division up until about the 18th century between lowland Scots or English-speaking Scotland and the Highland Gaelic-speaking Scotland. With the belief in improvement in the minds of landowners, they began to reshape the Highlands completely, actions which in many ways still define the landscapes and demography of the Highlands today. Essayist Samuel Johnson, following a tour of the Highlands in the 1770s, encapsulated the ideological position influencing improvers when he wrote of the Highlands, this quote here: "In an age accustomed to flowery pastures and waving harvests, one is astonished and repelled by the wide extent of hopeless sterility he saw in the Highlands." I don't know what kind of Highlands he was looking at, but it's not one that's recognisable to me. The most famous of these practices in the clearances were the mass removal of Gaelic-speaking people from inland areas in order to replace their homes and farmlands with sheep farms, which estates saw as a more reliable source of income and a fundamentally better use for land. It also involved, clearance also involved forced migration to reorganise coastal communities, and as a sort of in an attempt to form rural urbanisation as manufacturing hubs. Estates also directly intervened in the labour market in attempts to force Gaelic people to become labourers in single occupations rather than engaging in their traditional subsistence farming. Elsewhere, estates turned over former upland or forest grazing to be used as deer hunting grounds. and people's use of fishing was restricted to allow for the development of sport fishing. This process took place alongside industrialization and colonial expansion in the British Empire from around 1750 to sometime in the 19th century. You'll see different definitions stretching from 1820 as the final dates to all the way to the date that I prefer, which is 1886, although usually 1886 with a question mark, because as I will come on to later, the legacy of the clearances in some ways never really end. Tens of thousands of Gaelic people were resettled in the Highlands, and tens of thousands more chose to exile themselves beyond the Highlands, both in lowland Scotland, in urban Scotland particularly, and beyond Scottish shores, including here on Cape Breton. Simultaneously to the land reorganisation that we're talking about here, there was also a concerted effort to discourage, erase and racialise Gaelic people, their language and their culture, which is a familiar colonial practice. This process was vital to the narrative of the clearances because it allowed for the othering of the Gàidhealtachd, which permitted a very aggressive form of land clearance, which was unique within the islands of Britain and Ireland. Well, certainly in the island of Britain. There's very, very similar processes in Ireland. The state and elites fabricated perspectives based on returns from travel writers and fundamentally a stadial view of economic progress to present their views. T.C. Smout describes how in the Highlands, how in the lowlands, in the minds of people in the 18th century, the Highlands were a canvas on which the outsider could perceive very little clearly, and the little that was clear was not desirable. So the moral project could begin of civic cameralism, as it's described, and the Highlands were broken down into two components: soil as a resource and workforce as a resource. Modernity was to be brought to the Highlands. Inherent to the improvement ideology which had taken hold of British society was this view that the Highlands were undeveloped. And this comes from Thomas Hobbes's ideas of the states of nature and the idea that this was a primitive or a past ideal of the planet. And it was a system that needed to be reformed to be able to arrive at modernity. The classic literature, the historical literature of the clearances of the mid-20th century, in my view, accepted the underlying economic and social assumptions of the 18th century elites, either by failing to critically engage properly with the way that they approached history, but also in some cases by explicitly defending the positionalities of these 18th century and 19th century elites. Their liberal historical and economic analyses gave them a positionality which allowed them to accept the viewpoints of the elites of the clearances. The Highlands were poor and backward in their view. Reform and capitalism were inevitable, and society had to develop somehow. If you've read much of Highland history, you may be familiar with the work of someone like A.J. Youngson, who described the Highlands as underdeveloped, of Malcolm Gray, who described Gaels as peasants, I.F. Grant, who described Gaelic life as primitive. The Academy was simply comfortable with the prejudices of the Enlightenment, which underpinned the clearances. Rosalind Mitchison, for example, praised the consideration and skill with which Gaelic people were torn from their ancestral lands. Frequently, authors disregarded the beliefs, community feelings, and lived experiences of the people that they wrote about. Jean Dunlop, for example, writes, she wrote in this in 1978, which is too late even for this period, even for the kind of backwardsness of the historiography in this period. She wrote that emigration was not forced on Highlanders in the 18th and 19th centuries by unemployment or destitution, a fact which bears no particular analysis, bears no credibility in history. I'll note at this point that, to my mind, it's hard not to speculate that the perspectives that these people held were rooted in some kind of discomfort with Gaelic language and Gaelic people, and certainly a disinterest in the Gaelic language archive of oral testimony, storytelling, and campaigning poetry. The more modern literature, these two being the most notable books, and some of you may have read them, of the last 2 decades. My view is that while these offer a new perspective and a much better engagement with the historical narrative, for example, they accept without question that the Highland clearances happened and were traumatic experiences. My view is that they still hold onto some of the epistemologies of the older literature. Eric Richards sort of describes in his book that the clearances were unavoidable, which in my view and the view of one of the reviewers of the book when it first came out, Euan Cameron at Edinburgh, who described this an act of sitting on the fence, a moral equivocation with the activity of the clearers. And these books both accept in many ways that the Highlands had endemic problems which could only really be solved by the emergence of capitalism. And this, to me, accepts for certain things or some serious issues about the development of capitalism and an exception that capitalism's development is inevitable. And for me, this is a misreading of what Highland history can tell us about its economy prior to the clearances. Philip Robinson Rusner, the intellectual historian, defines the Highland economy at the outbreak of improvement in the mid-18th century as one in which agrarian production was embedded in social logics that were only partially market-oriented, but also partially cooperative and partly corporational patriarchic. The lay experience fundamentally was of a mixed commercial and subsistence economy with the idea of capital accumulation, particularly in the form of land, which underpinned British capitalism, was not particularly familiar to Highland people at the time. To presume that the Highlands were ripe for improvement is to perhaps buy our historical writing into the very ideology of contemporary elites. So, my view is that we should be doing historical research, particularly research of the clearances, which seeks to recenter the core realities and lived experiences of ordinary people in the clearances, and that's what my work attempts to do. Primarily for me, this looks like using a body of testimony given in situ by Gaelic-speaking people in 1883 as part of government attempts to mitigate against land clearance. It was called the Napier Commission, named after a former governor of Madras, Francis Lord Napier, who chaired the commission, and it, in my mind, provides a unique and unparalleled window into lived experiences of Highland life. In fact, both of these authors here agreed with me. They both praised the source of the clearances, the source of the Napier Commission as a really useful source, but neither of them refer to it more than 5 times in the whole book. Tells you quite perhaps how valuable they thought it was. The Napier Commission travelled around the Highlands to 61 locations where they interviewed 775 individuals, asking them about 50,000 questions about their lives. While other government inquiries did take place at the time, none had as broad or as significant a remit as the Napier Commission. Most testimony at the time was given in Gaelic. However, the translation, we only remain today with the translations into English, which were submitted to Parliament. The original notes are lost to time, though they were translated simultaneously by Gaelic interpreters. While this limits the utility of the testimony in some respects, of course, it limits our ability to look at specific words or phrases, as one would in a traditional close reading of a source like this. It remains one of the most inexplicably underutilized source materials for broad narratives of popular belief in the clearances. In addition to this, I integrate the oral record with an archaeological record, which helps us to triangulate and gain a deeper understanding of the Gaelic experience of the clearances. Many places that are described in the Napier Commission remain living on the soil today. You can walk among the townscapes and the villages that were cleared during the clearances and that people bemoan and are heartbroken about their loss from. And Lord Napier actually acknowledged the importance of the physical space in understanding the narrative of the clearances. In his report, when he submitted to Parliament, he wrote, "The history of the economical transformation of the Highlands is written in indelible characters on the surface of the soil." So my view of what an alteration of our perspectives on the clearances and a refocusing on popular experience, while my view of what this can show us is that it can illuminate things which are hidden in the estate or elite archives, which these books primarily rely on. And for me, this has been particularly informative at the intersection of people's experience of both their work and the natural environment. My view is that in the Napier Commission we can see a specific moral economy of the land expressed by people, which I argue can help us to understand more intimately both the clearances themselves and their long-term violence against ordinary people's lives still felt today. Moral economy is if you're not familiar, the idea that economic relationships are underpinned by a particular accepted community morality. When this breaks down, when someone violates the accepted morality, this causes an outpouring of grievance. The original theorization was done during agitation against the increase in prices of grain in industrializing England, but it's been widely transferred into lots of concepts sort of across the globe. My view is that the speakers of the Napier Commission asserted this morality of the land with three dominant principal tenets. The idea that the land provided a deeply felt direct connection to their kin, the idea that the land's job was to provision for labour, and finally that the land and that labour were there to provide the ability primarily for the people to subsist. That was the point of land in this period. In each case, the denial by clearance of these provisions was a deep traumatic and moral affront to the Gaelic-speaking people that I'll be talking about here. I argue that Gaels saw the landscapes that they lived on in the form of a kinscape. Now, this is an idea that I've sort of proposed. Something scape is a very popular motif within academia at the moment, but I think it's very useful to understand here the way that the land bore deep familial connection. The soil, the water, the grass, and the construction of things atop it connected people to their family. Land was a space of exchange with departed, contemporary, and future kin. Ancestors had invested in this space to create the townships that people were cleared from, Balchan in Gaelic, only in understanding the way that this intergenerationality had fabricated the kinscape can we come to understand the violence of the clearances. One delegate, Napier delegate Angus Mackay, as I've quoted on here, describes how when he was cleared, we and our forefathers have been cruelly burnt out like wasps out of Strathnaver and forced down to the barren rocks of the seashore, where we had in many places to carry the earth on our backs to form a patch of land. This, I think, helps us to understand that kinship wasn't a spiritual concept, it was a profoundly practical one. The soil that Angus Mackay's family carried from Strathnaver to Strathy Point, where he ended up living, was a distance of about 15 kilometres. It represents the effort at which previous kin had fabricated the space in which he'd previously lived and how he had to exert effort to refabricate that new post-clearance space. It's a story also told in Donald MacLeod's very famous narrative of the clearances, Gloomy Memories from 1892, in which he emphasises that the soil that they carried to the shore actually contained the ashes of their ancestors. And there's a surprisingly practical way that archaeology can provide us an insight into this particular aspect of kin fabrication, is that soil analyses by colleagues in archaeology departments in Scotland have been completed on locations in Skye and on Lewis, and what they've shown is that the pre-clearance settlements have physically better soils than the surrounding areas. This is a representation of intentional focused deposition of human and animal manures, animal food, bedding, and food waste, providing descendants with richer, more reliable farmland and habitation. And this is a photo from that I've taken in Langdale and Strathnaver, and this, if you look sort of carefully on here, you can see what is essentially a levelled out area of the hillside here. And this represents, there's just beyond the photo here, there's what was certainly a dwelling here. And if you were to do a soil test on this particular area, there's probably a kale yard, maybe just a small animal pen. If you were to test the soil here, you would be able to record that the soil there was physically better, richer in particular nutrients valuable for soil, for plant and crop development than you would find elsewhere within the same neighbourhood. This represents the ways in which families not only invested in their land to improve their own provision, but by investing in the land, by depositing carefully their waste material in specific locations, they were improving the quality of the soil for ancestors. By removing people from their land, as part of the clearances, there was this inherent loss of this long-term envelopment. I mean, Langdale here, there's a first documentary mention of it as a settlement in 1269. So there's 600 years or so of inhabitation, which is then cleared on Whitsunday 1814 by Patrick Seller. Now, the significance of land as a labouring space is also fundamental to understanding the importance of land or space to Gaels. And the most important thing to understand about it is that Gaelic people lived a transhuman lifestyle. Their idea of workplace is very different to your or I's idea of workplace. Their workplace encompassed the whole glen and upland areas, particularly the sort of 2 parts of their year, which is spent in the winter in the inland area for the harvest, and then for the planting in the spring, and then the summer being spent on the upland pastures called a shealing ground. And what that meant was when clearance took place and they were designated these small plots of land, this is from the estate plan for the clearance of Strathnaver, when they designated these small plots of land, each of them about 2 to 3 acres, is that the reflexivity which people were used to exacting or working on their subsistence behaviour, subsistence labour, was lost. They were trapped between their neighbours' pieces of land. And this kind of can help us to understand the specific violence of that geographical aspect of the clearances. This quote here from Adam Gunn of Strathy, which is just a bit further to the east than this this plan is from. He describes, of course, how the sea blast destroys his crops every year. Another individual from Strathalladale, who was a little bit further inland, describes how his land is very bad, generally overflowed by the river. The way that the estates sought to demarcate specifically which areas of lands crofters were able to work on meant that they were not able to be reflexive when their land was damaged or undercut by the environmental checks, such as the sea and the river in this context. And for Gaelic people whose labour was vested in, on the whole, particularly when it came to their arable farming, was vested in a single harvest of potatoes every year. The idea of risk being applied to this space was a huge threat. Because if you survive you plant in the spring, you survive the whole summer with your potatoes looking like they're going to yield for you in October. You get to the 30th of September, a large storm washes away your crops. That's that for you. That's your entire crop, and you're pushed into starvation, as regularly happened in the 19th century. Particularly in the 1830s and 40s, when there were a number of serious potato famines. The restriction of upland pasture is also significant because this provided a check on pastoral farming as well. Cattle was a significant part of the Highland economy prior to this period, and their loss of upland pasture specifically passed on the upland pasture to, I think I might have another quote, the upland pasture being specifically moved on to given to the sheep farmers because it was better land, because the sheep farmers could yield a good profit from it, was something that people were particularly aggrieved from. N here is Lord Napier, and the M here is William Mackenzie, who describing to the Napier Commission about how he lost his good upland pasture, and Napier becoming aware that this was a deliberate practice of the estates to rob the good pasture and give the people the bad pasture. This was, a violation in the sense that people should have been able to work the land for food. This was their belief, and what underpinned the value of the land should have been. And it was in losing this that we see this violence. And finally, I want to talk about a particularly well-known, aspect of the clearances, which is the increase in blood sport, hunting of deer in the Highlands. And John Murdoch here wrote a fantastic piece of literature. It's very short in English and in Gaelic, a pamphlet just before the Napier Commission passed around called The Land Question Answered from the Bible, or in Gaelic, a much better name, Euan Healey, the Jubilee of the Gaels. And it's this idea that that he argues that the first charge upon the land is to support the husbandman whose labour so increases food. The idea that upland pasture would be turned over to a sporting exercise, that elites could travel to the Highlands and partake in some sort of masculine cosplay of Gaelic life, because Highlandism was rife, and this was the idea. Edward Landseer was painting images like this. People saw the Highlands as this place of adventure and excitement and bloody violence against animals, and this is what people wanted to see when they came to the Highlands. And so estates developed forests that they could sell off to, or they could rent out to people who wanted to run these estate hunting grounds. And there's lots of testimony in the Napier Commission about how people saw and felt that the pain that they saw while they were struggling to eat. They saw elite people coming through and chasing deer through the land that their cattle had previously grazed upon. And at the Loch-Inver session of the Commission, there's a lot about this, because the Glencanisp forest, if you've ever been to Assynt, which is in the west of Sutherland, the Glencanisp forest runs basically right up to the back of the village. And there's a particular, the local minister sort of represents the local people here when he describes how they've built this fence around the Glencanisp forest, which he says is low enough for the deer to jump into the corn of the tenants, but it's so high that if any cow tries to get over it, it will be stopped. The idea that the estate had fabricated an idea in which they demarcated the hunting ground from the people's farmland, but the deer could get fat on their corn, but their own cows couldn't graze up on in the forest. The same practice was pursued against the rivers, which people were banned from fishing salmon, so that it could be used for angling, which is another practice that was exceedingly popular. And it's important to note that these two, that hunting of deer and angling, are probably two of the largest economic producers of activity economic producers in the Highlands. This was the moment when this arrived. It's not an ancient practice of people going. In the 1850s or so, people began to come up to the Highlands to exact this. And you get these images like Edward Landseer's The Monarch of the Glen have become kind of eponymous, kind of representative of what the Highlands is as a place, despite the fact that it was once very well inhabited and it remains well inhabited. And so I just want to finish off by saying that I think the repositioning ourselves with the way that we approach histories like this, particularly with non-capitalist cultures and the way that the non-capitalist economies developed, we can come to have a better understanding of the way in which capitalism's arrival exerted exceeding violence on ordinary people's lives. And it is only in doing this that we can actually really come to understand the inhabitants of the Highlands at the time of the clearances are not just victims, but people for whom their experience was visceral and real. But also in the face of that, they used opportunities to voice their extreme pain, like the Napier Commission. They created new cultures. They created one of the first mass movement political parties in British history. The violence of the clearances was not merely an abject of aggressor and victim, but it was people who remade their culture, their economy, and their lifestyles in the face of this extreme violence. And it's only in doing that we can understand the longer history of the Highlands as a place as it is today, and also of the Highland diaspora as it came to the rest of the world. Thank you.
All right, well, we have plenty of time for questions, so I'll open the floor, and anybody who wants to ask Euan about his work is free to do so. All right, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So exciting to hear your research. I feel like I have a few questions, but I'll maybe just start with one, see how the room goes. Can you tell me a little bit about, you talked about the value of understanding the ongoing consequences of the clearances. Are you speaking to people today? What do people today see as the ongoing impact of the clearances in their lives?
Yeah. So in 1961, that's not the right date. There's a very famous book called The Highland Clearances, which was written by a journalist who's named John Preble. And in John Preble's book, you may be familiar, he writes one of the things that he says in this book that's always stuck with me since I read it, and something that Jim Hunter picks up on in his work as well, is the phrase, "the hills are still empty." It's the idea that the clearances happened and they won, that the land clearance if you go to the Highlands now, it's the reason that people use words like wilderness to talk about the Highlands is because the idea that the Highlands is this empty space in which there's all sorts of uninhabited areas. That's a new thing. It was invented 200 years ago when these inland spaces were cleared. And I think that's one aspect of it. And it's also the fact that the Highlands is sort of seen, certainly today. There's a very famous Gaelic poem called Praise of Ben Lawyers, which sort of talks about the greying of the landscape, in which the Highlands went from being what was I'm not saying it was very, very fertile, but it was more fertile than it is today, because among other things, sheep and deer are a very aggressive consumer of vegetation. And what that means is that you get the sort of ecological monoculture which exists in the Highlands today, which is of the more hardy grasses and heather and bracken, which the ecological context of the Highlands today is a product of the way that the land structure was re-evaluated during the clearances. And if you look at any kind of population demographic in the Highlands today, you can look at just simple population distribution. People are still living in the cleared spaces. And that's not to say that those spaces haven't wonderfully been remade as inherent to people's experience of their own culture, but fundamentally these are new places for Gaelic people to inhabit, and certainly in the density that they do. And so I suppose there's that kind of macro aspect of the violence of the clearances, which you could look at on a map and in an image. But there's also the fact that right now in the Highlands there is an acute housing crisis, and there is an acute jobs crisis, which are products of this kind of longer history of estate extraction of the valuable assets from the landscape, and the fact that they sort of change their design. There is a definite chameleon aspect to the way that Highland estates have changed their economic decision making, in the sense that it started with sheep and then it moves to this hunting, and then there's a big input in focus on fishing, and then today there's this big focus on tourism being the main dominant aspect. I mean, and that's I could talk about that for a really long time. But fundamentally for me, and this is one of the things that I think it's not just about the way that we approach the economic, I'm an economic social historian, so that's my interest, but actually the problems of the way that we approach the Highlands as underpinned by the 20th century literature and these books that I showed here, which are these are in all the bookshops. Everywhere you go, you'll find both of these books. And the problem with the approaches that these books take, the fact that they're essentially not vitriolic against the landlords enough, in one essence, is that they underpin the logics of what people's experiences of the Highlands are, and they still contain within that romanticism, that belittling of the historic barbarian Gael, which I think means that people still have this kind of standoffish relationship with the Highlands in a different way to they do to other rural economies within Scotland. Yeah, that was a very long answer.
Well, that was great. Thank you.
I'm struck by when you were talking about the Napier Commission and what an incredible resource. So is it more accessible now, or is it still, because I think when you were talking about physical spaces and then the interviews, what an incredible option for different projects, like digital humanities projects, to actually have the language out there linked. And I'm not sure how detailed the actual locations are with the interviews, but I'm just curious if you can talk more about, I guess, how accessible it is.
Yeah, sure. So we know, taking your question in reverse, we know where many of the buildings that they took, the actual commission took place in, still stand. They're mostly churches that were used. Sometimes they were drill holes and things like that. But so you can go to the actual buildings, the rooms where the interviews took place, and it doesn't take much reconstruction. But most of the people are listed when they're in their evidence. One of the problems is we don't 100%, because we don't have many of the original notes of the construction. We just have the final product. We don't know that there's a labeling system which is used for people, which we don't know who came up with that, i.e. did people fill in their own details in which they said, this is where I live, this is my job, or did someone kind of make an assumption from the end of their testimony after the fact, or did someone ask them offhand or whatever? Because some of the, and there's a whole bunch of linguistic problems there with if people expressed what they did in Gaelic, for example, if they said the Gaelic word for farmer, did they, because the word farmer doesn't appear that much, so if they said that they were farmers, did the estate then write crofter because that was their rental position? It's a great question, but so that's kind of unknown, but it's not hard to reconstruct the actual physical locations from where people were from, because a lot of them say, I'm representing X community, or I grew up in Y community, because these places are really important to their understanding of self, and so they, and so you can very easily do that, including with what I did here with this Angus Mackay fella. I had to impute from the text where he lived, and then I can work out the physical distance that he had to carry soil from where he used to live to where he came to live. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a huge capacity for digital humanities kind of things to be done here. At about 15 miles upriver from Strathnaven, maybe 5 miles upriver actually, from Langdale here, there is one of the best known, largest communities of the area, which is a huge piece of exchange, like a piece of open field system. It's remarkable how big it is, and it's still there. But they have, if you go there, it's very kind of bizarre. I don't know who paid for it, because it's like you've got to walk 2 miles away from the road, and you get up there, and there is a speaker inside a wooden box which you can open up and press play on it, and you can do it in English and Gaelic, and on there it's retellings from Gloomy Memories, which is one of the first kind of literary descriptions of the story of the clearances, which was written by a cleared individual who was from that community. So that kind of thing. In terms of the actual sources availability to all the writers, it was always available. It's in the National Libraries of Scotland. It's all in English. It's actually very easy to access source. In fact, it's not even in secretarial hands. Someone at some point, probably in the 30s, by the looks of the printing, has typed it all up. So it's very easy to access. It's now digitally available. If you're interested, you can go and have a look. It's on the University of the Highlands and Islands website. You can go on there, and they have, they have all of the sort of PDFs on there, and it's a fully searchable. It's a remarkable source. But if you're teaching undergrads and they're looking for a very easy source on Scottish history, almost recommend it to my undergrads.
I have a question, Euan. So if we're thinking about the clearances as a disruption of the moral economy of the land as a workplace, and that has some sort of cultural resonance, I guess the first part of that is, what is the reaction to the disruption of the moral economy? Like, in what way do people act against that and disrupt it happening? And then the second element is, I'm thinking later of ongoing history in the Highlands, and the work of people like Jim Phillips or Andy Purchard who write about Invergordon and the smelter, and the disruption of that work location, and again, using that idea of moral economy to think about the place of industry in the Highlands, because industry also sits not particularly well within a packaged view of the Highlands, right? So we're separated here by 100 years, but I want to get a sense of what you make of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the first part of the question about how people responded, I mean, I think what I would suggest is that the sort of traditional violences which we know of the story of the clearances, things like the Battle of the Braes, for example, on Skye, which is a fantastic story of, if you're not familiar, of local women basically turning away a group of the constabulary, the police, which had been sent from Inverness to try and help evict people by standing at the top of a hill and throwing a bunch of stones at them. It's fantastic. And there's other kind of similar stories of this kind of agitation, is that we should obviously understand the clearances as this violation of people's loss of home, but actually in a similar way we should understand this as a workplace conflict in which people are fighting for their physical space. And it's a way that I think we as labour historians have a tendency in our writing to patronise, or to preference, I should say, to preference the urban industrial over the rural, is that we have this tendency to not think of rural workplaces as workplaces in the same way. And that's kind of one of the contentions that I make with my research, is that that's one of the things that's going on. There's an example of, this is a research project that I did last year as part of my research master's thesis, My more recent research focuses on the maritime aspects, particularly of the fishing industry, the development of the fishing industry in the Highlands. And there's a great story on Tiree, which is an island sort of in the sort of southwest Hebrides, of the Duke of Argyll trying to create a fishing community. And he basically offers a bounty to the community to say, well, he first builds this village and then says, get a bunch of people to his factor, get a bunch of people to come in and have it here and become fishermen. And the following year, we see in the ledger a letter from the factor which says, I can't find anyone who wants to do it. And that is, to me, an example of like people agitating their desire to not be fishermen. And that was because there's various reasons as to why it was not seen as a desirable job, which you can all read about in my forthcoming PhD thesis. No spoilers. And so yeah, there's lots of examples of that kind of agitation. On industry, I think it's very interesting. One of the things that the states are really desire to do is they think that because these people are only subsistence labourers, they're lazy, right? And so they want to create manufacturing hubs which are going to be, their view is to revolutionise the economy in such a way to create essentially urban culture in these villages which become manufacturing focal points, supplying the local area with manufacturing goods to basically create a self-fulfilling local economy. Never happens, doesn't work, for various reasons, not least the fact that people are too poor to be able to afford any kind of luxury, and people also have a long tradition of like home industry, and so therefore people are just very well versed in making their own things that people buy in an urban context, like clothes, but even things like fishing nets and stuff, people made their own, and so that was sort of a big part of it. And particularly women were integral to the economy of the Gàidhealtachd up until this point, particularly in the fishing industry. They were the ones who did most of the manufacturing for things like the netting, but also the, like, as many people will know, the sort of more well known is that the packing element of the fishing industry was a female-dominated industry, even though there was usually a male overseer who was paid significantly more than the women who did it. But anyway, yeah, it's kind of
yeah, thank you.
Question. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I think you answered one of my questions. You mentioned open fields just in passing. What was the agricultural landscape that these guys were taken out of? What was the arrangements?
Yeah. So the Gaelic word is runrig,
right?
Which you may know as the fantastic trad band. But runrig was a system in which the local land was held by a taxman, who the taxman gets a bad rep in historical writing, in my view, and Eric Cregeen's written quite well on this. If you're interested in reading, he's got a couple of articles about the role of the taxman and the position of the local land economy. So the taxman would hold the sort of land as a sort of on behalf of the community, because the taxman was drawn from the larger clan family. So the idea of the local area being run by the clan chief, again, I'm putting this in inverted commas, not because people didn't believe it, because it wasn't really like true, in the sense that the clan chief wasn't actually related to everyone who lived nearby, as some people like to pretend, and the taxman was usually related to the clan chief in the sense, but he was drawn from the local area, and he was someone who was at least tangentially associated with the kinship with the clansman, with the clan chief. And so you get this kind of the sort of corporo-patriarchic element that I talked about, of the sort of patrilineal relationship between areas of landholding. Now the taxman would oversee the particular community, maybe one balchin, maybe several, and the land within it would be demarcated by an outer wall dike, which ran around the outside, and the land inside would be commonly held, and usually, or at least there's some narratives which express that the best land in the area was basically, the land was you were allocated a space to farm as a man within the community, and the best bits of land would be given to the best farmers who could yield the highest. It's sort of meritocratic, and the worst land was given to worse people. And you see this as like a long-term process in which, over time, you get the longer inhabited settlements, you get things which are called clearance cairns, which are like basically big piles of rocks. Clearance, small c, not related to the Highland clearances, but they are basically of people physically clearing the worse, clearing the stones out of their soil over decades of farming as they came up, being farmed either with an ox plough or with a single horse plough. By the 18th century, you get the traditional hand plough, which is used, or a foot plough, which is like a big thing. You can still see them in museums that you use like this, has sort of been phased out by the 18th century. It then has to be brought back in when after the clearances, because people, because the land is worse, and so because there's so many stones in it, you can't get a horse to drag a plough through it, and so, yeah, that's the. It's quite a. You know, it looked like a disorganized agricultural system, which you would not be disorganized in the sense that it wasn't like demarcated in strict lines with hedgerows like you would see in other parts of Scotland or England, but the actual agricultural farming practice was pretty like similar to what you would see elsewhere.
I guess my own thinking, I mentioned this earlier, how does that system that you're familiar with compare to the open field villages? I was just at one in Furraberry in Cornwall, but Broughton, Blackstone.
Yeah. I don't know would be the answer to that question. I've never been. I have not looked at the way that they're set up today, which I probably should. But yeah, I don't know 100%. But there isn't at the moment anywhere which is doing a kind of recreation of the run rig system in the Highlands to make a direct kind of modern comparison of the same thing. But from what I understand, there are lots of similarities between pre-enclosure farming in different parts of England and lowland Scotland and the Highland system, which survives a little bit later until the 18th century.
Right, because those places I mentioned, they were never enclosed.
Right.
And curious as to why.
Mm.
So I guess the only other, one other question. My familiarity is with Southeast England and East Anglia, and much of England was enclosed.
Mm.
And as you talked about this phenomenon, can we talk about England clearances?
That's a good question.
I mean, England was cleared and they went to the cities.
Yeah.
These places were cleared and they migrated.
Yeah.
Is it the same phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, depends who you ask. But so like this book here, Tom Devine's The Scottish Clearances, is not called, as you can see, the Highland Clearances, because he argues that there is a very similar process which takes place in lowland Scotland. My contention is that underplays the specific cultural prejudices which underpin the Highland Clearances, and it's part of, and this is where I think the Highland Clearances exist, to me at least, within a long history of enclosure within the British Isles, but it's perhaps more helpful to understand them in a more similar way to we would understand enclosure in Ireland, particularly in the sense that there is a slight colonial element to the way that these lands are cleared, but the actual physical processes look similar. Maybe not identical, but certainly similar. But it's just that enclosure doesn't happen until this sort of late up here. The enclosure tends to happen a little bit earlier in England, a couple of centuries. Yeah.
So Highland Clearances becomes a political rhetoric in some ways.
Oh, for sure. I mean, absolutely. The Highlands become this awkward existence within the metropolitan imperial narrative of what their world should look like, in that they're going all over the world to improve different corners of the world which they see as backwards, but then they become sort of offended at the fact that their own country has this backward space on their own island. It's like it's sort of like the empire at home in that kind of way, and that's kind of the approach that's taken in some respects. I don't know, there's a literature waiting to be written on that, which is not done yet, but there's lots of people working on this kind of space. I'd recommend Ian McKinnon's essay, journal article called Colonialism and the Highland Clearances, which offers one perspective. It's not everyone agrees with it, but I think it's a really good primer on kind of the positionalities which we can kind of see going on here. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
I just have a question about the carrying of soil or sod.
Was that common, and is there evidence that when those families left Scotland and maybe came overseas, did they also take any soil with them as a tie back to their home country?
Good question. Common, we don't know. It's a narrative that comes up quite a bit in the literatures of the period. Again, there's not an unlimited body of source material for what people did as a direct response to clearance. A lot of the sort of good sources come later, a couple of decades after the clearance themselves. But it comes up a lot, which suggests that either it was a popular thing that people like to say in a kind of metaphoric flourish way, or that it was a good story that someone in their community had done. But to me, it stands to reason that it might not have been an uncommon practice in places where it was practical, in the sense that here at the mouth of the Neva, where this settlement is, these people were cleared from places which were probably only like 5 to 10 kilometers away, so it's not too difficult. Whereas you get people who were cleared more like 30 or 40 kilometers, becomes perhaps slightly less believable, but not impossible. But especially because these would have been people, just like walking on foot, so you don't know exactly. But I mean, it stands to reason in the sense that the soil on the coast is awful, and so like it's grass and then sand, and so if you were trying to plant these places, you would need to get soil from somewhere. But whether they necessarily carried it from their home or just the first bit of soil that they found walking away from where they lived is a question for, I don't know, a source material that we don't have. In terms of bringing it to Canada, I don't know. It's possible. I guess unlikely, because of how much stuff people were tended to bring on the boats, because soil's not light as well, and you take up a lot of your suitcase. But I'm not 100% sure on that. It's a good question.
I guess just to add on, so the soil thing then, is it like a symbolic thing, or is it like purely a practical thing, or is it both, right?
I'd say both.
If symbolic, somebody might bring a little bit, like how is that viewed?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I think Gaelic people, their spirituality in the 19th century, they have what we might call a lot of superstitious parts to their the way that they approach the world. That there's a deep belief in and this is what sort of sits uncomfortably between the strict and avowed Presbyterianism, which they hold on to, and some element of mysticism, which is still exists within the community. People talk about creatures living in water, and particularly when something unexplained happens, there's lots of doing things like burying a bit of milk as like a way to make sure that your yield of milk is good, or all sorts of stuff like that. So there's a kind of hybrid spirituality between the sort of traditionally Christian and non-traditionally Christian stuff, which they certainly don't really see as being a problem. But the source that I'm working with, Napier Commission, is not a hugely spiritual source. People are not tending to talk about the more spiritual aspects of their life. There's lots of reasons. You can imagine it being an intimidating experience to interact in this way. And also, like, they're doing it inside the church often, so that can kind of be a spatial kind of reason why people might decide that they don't want to talk about things that their priest might not particularly enjoy. So the actual spiritual read across is interesting, and it's not explicit. The practical is more explicit, even though we don't tend to think of kinship as a concept as a practical one. But fundamentally, I think for them it is. Clanship and kinship are practical concepts for these people. And so for me, it's kind of a hybrid of both. It's a spiritual thing, it's a spiritual connection to the ancestors and to their descendants and what they owe to the land and owe to the space. So there's kind of a practical and a practical and a spiritual aspect to it.
Thank you.
Well, to build on like the practicality as well, like transporting soil like that, you're just not taking like the medium, you're taking all those microbial communities that have grown and flourished under those practices with having cattle and those years of improvements, and even taking a handful of that are taking those microbial communities and those specific nutrients that are needed that can then flourish in their new locations.
Yeah.
So without, they probably didn't know anything about the microbial aspect of the soil at that point, but there was a lot of...
It's interesting you say that, because no, microbes as a word, not familiar with, but these are agricultural people. They fundamentally understand that manuring makes your work much easier. They understand that something about the way that both animal and human manure, something we really don't like to talk about, but these people love to human manure, they do that, and nothing is wasted. So the old thatch goes into the, when the thatch is removed to be replaced every year, that goes into the soil to be regenerated. Lots of things like, and they eat a lot of fish, so fish bone waste, very high, like nutrient-rich stuff goes into the soil. Any kind of food scraps or anything like that is going back into the soil. Nothing is waste, it's going back into the kind of process. They kind of understand that kind of exchange and the kind of conviviality of farm life, which, they don't name in a kind of food science kind of way that you or I might, or agricultural science, but they kind of understand what's going on. And so, that's obviously another violence of the clearances, is that as their numbers of cattle reduce, as the clearances go on, they have less upland pasture, they can't hold on to, they're also starving, so they're killing a lot more cattle for food, that they're also losing access to that manuring process.
I just wanted to ask you, what originally drew you to researching Highland clearances?
Where are you from?
The Isle of Skye.
Oh, brilliant. Whereabouts?
Elgo.
Okay. It's a great question. I came in from as you can tell, I'm not originally from Scotland. I came into the study of the Highland clearances with an interest in land politics, community land politics, and particularly the process of combination ethnic violence and land clearance, as is like a very common motif in the sort of early colonial period. And I go on holiday to the Highlands every year. I spent a lot of time in Assynt, sort of growing up, and still to this day. And so I guess that might have produced a familiarity, but I'm an accidental Highland scholar, not an intentional one. My research interests are more broadly just in the interaction of environment and labour. And I ended up doing the clearances because it was a really interesting place to study that interaction. But that's sort of it.
Okay, well, if there's no further questions, thank you, Euan, for sharing with us today, and we're pleased to have you with us.